So it is my pleasure to present Doug Larkin.
Hey, welcome, everyone. So my task right now this morning is to set the stage for the conversations that we're going to have later on in the day. And I thought the best way to do that as the self-identified science teacher is to present you with a puzzling phenomenon. And the puzzling phenomenon we're going to present today is the labor force of science, technology, engineering, math, and computer science teachers in the state of New Jersey. So I recognize at the outset that this talk is going to be a little New Jersey focused, and I hope that as a case study, those of you not from New Jersey can find parallels to your own states, and I suspect many of the issues that are present here in New Jersey are also present in other Northeast states as well. So just to give a brief overview of what ground we're going to cover here. So I want to talk first about definitions, because there are often some slippery definitions about what counts as STEM, what counts as high-needs schools, and there's some very clear definitions that NSF has that I think will be useful, at least in terms of framing what we're doing here today. I also want to bring up the New Jersey policy context. We've had some recent changes in the state that have had implications for teacher education that are worth just mentioning here. Then I'm going to take some time and look at our STEM teacher demographics in New Jersey. And I've been doing this work now for almost 2 decades, and I found some surprises in here that I'd like to share with you. Then I'd like to talk about who's actually preparing math and science teachers in New Jersey. And I say math and science, but there's also others in there, but the large bulk are math and science. And then I want to spend the last chunk of the talk talking about retention, particularly 3 different ways of measuring that. And then I'll end this talk with the framing critical questions for the 2 breakout sessions that we'll be having today. So a word about STEM. The one thing one of my goals for this conference was to avoid the conversation of, is this STEM, is this not STEM, that's not STEM, this is STEM. I don't find those conversations productive. And I think broadly we can trace this power that this label of STEM has back to post-World War II, and I'm putting up a copy of the book, Scientists in the Classroom, by my friend John Rudolph, who has talked about the power that science had after World War II and math and technology and engineering, and how those were seen to have won the war, and that the cachet that those fields have has carried through even into the 21st century, even sometimes a little uncritically. And so I think it's worth just recognizing from the outset that just because we call something STEM doesn't necessarily make it, it may not always have that same power that we ascribe to the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. And you can do this by just Googling STEM logos. This is just a screenshot of the image base. Social studies logos are not as cool, right? So there, and this is just the first page. There are many pages of STEM, and there's always STEAM in there, and I've seen some STEMs, people add on their fields into it. But really, we have quite a proliferation of STEM programs, and it still carries weight as a field. However, I want to trouble the notion that we have a STEM shortage in particular. And that doesn't mean that preparing STEM teachers isn't important. I think it's critically important. But when we just focus on the economic rationale of filling STEM jobs, we have to actually look at the STEM labor force. And by the way, all these slides will be available on the conference website afterwards. But when we look at Robert Sherrill's work, where he's actually examining how many STEM jobs are available versus how many people with STEM degrees are there, we actually have quite a surplus of STEM people with STEM college degrees who are not working in STEM fields. And it's interesting when you get into the reasons why. When we talk about a STEM labor shortage, and we frame it as, we don't have enough people who can do these STEM careers, that's not quite true. We don't have enough people who would do STEM careers at the race to the bottom wages, right? That's part of the issue. And so I think it's important from the outset that we try to define what it is that we're talking about in terms of the problem. I think in terms of fostering mathematical literacy, science literacy among a population so that people can deal with issues like climate change in a rational and thoughtful way is critically important. And for me, that's part of the engine behind preparing STEM teachers. So when we look at the NSF definition of what STEM means, they say it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and includes computer science. As we will see, computer science is it's looking for a home, and we think computer science has found a home within STEM, but we still need to formalize it somehow within our certification programs in teacher education in New Jersey and across the country, and that's actually one of the sessions today. When we look at what STEM teacher means, it means somebody who teaches one of these things, science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, and including computer science, including the elementary level or the middle school or secondary school level. So in New Jersey, when we see who fits into that category, we have exactly what you would expect, right? Our mathematics teachers, biology, life science, chemistry, physics, earth science, technology education, we have that certification in New Jersey, and our colleagues from the College of New Jersey, you're leading the way in that. The middle grade science and math, early childhood, and then we also have, computer science is going to join the club very soon. We're just not sure how. And then we have all these other courses that are taught by people with science degrees, science education degrees, but are a little bit more amorphous. Things like the integrated STEM, forensics. Forensics is everywhere. Forensics is the new lacrosse. Lacrosse just appeared overnight in high schools across New Jersey like an invasive species. And forensics is like that. Now forensics is everywhere. My wife teaches forensics. Environmental science also. So there are these science courses that people teach that aren't necessarily the same name as the discipline, but we all lump them under STEM. Just one word about teaching. I really appreciate Dean Lucas's comments about teacher education and the importance of teaching. And so Ken Zeichner, who is now at the University of Washington, Seattle, likes to carry this book around with him. This is a real book. I went and I saw it. It's actually in Barnes & Noble, right? And so what does the presence of this book say about the value and the knowledge and skills necessary for teaching? So with apologies to The Daily Show, I made my own version of, just to show how ridiculous it is. We wouldn't say rookie surgery, right? We wouldn't say, go ahead and operate in a surgery. And I feel the same way about teaching. A good teacher, that's not a real book, by the way. So I photoshopped that. But I feel the same way about teaching. It takes a certain degree of knowledge, skills, and there's a continuum of learning. You don't just reach, you're not just this tall to ride this ride, and now you can ride the ride forever. You have to keep growing as a teacher. We know this. Okay. So in the Higher Education Act in 1965, this is still, those of you with Noyce programs know that we look to place our graduates in high-need schools, and those high-need schools are defined as having one of these followings. They have to have a high percentage of individuals with families from incomes below the poverty line. They have to have, or a high percentage of secondary school teachers not teaching in the content area in which they're certified, or they have a high teacher turnover rate. None of these are sharply defined in the federal legislation. It's left to the states to define them. But each state is required to submit that information to the federal government, and they publish it. And again, this may look very familiar to those of you who try to place Noyce graduates in school. This Teacher Cancellation Low Income Directory, TCLI, and you can look up your state and figure out what are the high-need schools in your state. So the state supplies that information to the federal government, and the federal government publishes it. So in New Jersey, we have two main criteria. They have to be eligible for Title I funds, which there's a whole other set of criteria for that. And they have to have an annual population of 30% or more free reduced lunch price eligible students, which is, Title I is almost 50%. So that second one is almost not needed, but there's a few outlier cases where it's important. So I'm going to start shifting to the New Jersey context. Oh, and there's nothing specific about the subject areas in the teacher shortage, in the high need schools definition. That comes up in the teacher shortage definitions, which again, the states report to the federal government, to the Department of Education. And those are defined as teaching positions that are unfilled, teaching positions that are filled by teachers who are certified by irregular, provisional, temporary, or emergency certification, which if you go alternate route, that you're contributing to the definition of an emergency certification, which is a problem, as we'll see in a little bit. Or if people are teaching in academic areas other than their area of preparation. So again, from a New Jersey standpoint, we have, there's been a list that's been published since 1991. New Jersey didn't submit any shortage areas until about 2005. So we told the federal government we don't have any teacher shortages until about 2005. And then, there's some perennials on there: bilingual, bicultural ed, ESL, world language always appear there, along with the math and science and special education. Recently, the elementary school with subject matter specialization, not necessarily just math or science, but any kind of specialization at the elementary school is considered a shortage area. Recently, the focus on career and technical education in New Jersey, they've added that to the list, all career and technical endorsements. Right now, those don't fall under STEM, but there's not that many of them. The number of career and technical endorsements issued every year it's around 50. It's not very large. Okay, so in New Jersey, many of you from New Jersey are familiar with this. This is for our out-of-state guests here. We have two ways of talking about teacher preparation in New Jersey. We have what we call the traditional route, and this image is from the New Jersey State website, the State Department of Ed website. We have this traditional route, and we have the alternate route. From the traditional route, you get a certificate of eligibility with advanced standing. When you finish, you have to teach for a year, and then you get your standard license. With the certificate of eligibility, you basically take some courses over the summer, and then you start teaching right away, and you continue taking courses. And again, once you finish that program and you finish that provisional period in your teaching, then you can apply for the standard license. Functionally, the main difference is that alternate route teachers, they learn to teach while they're the teacher of record. In the traditional program, we used to call it student teaching. We've changed the language now. It's now clinical practice. But it's full-time clinical practice. So the difference is that the traditional route, they teach in a setting mentored by a certified teacher, and they're with that teacher for the full, at least a semester. We're moving towards a more year-long model here. And in the alternate route, they are basically by themselves in the classroom, but they have supports throughout the school. The one quibble I have with this chart is the yellow, the area under the curve here, under step one of traditional route should be much larger because there's a lot that goes on there. It's not necessarily equivalent area. Okay, so on to some of the policy changes that we have in New Jersey. And many of these have been driven by teacher educators. Some of you in the room have helped to drive these policy changes. So we have a new basic skills test requirement. They have to take Praxis 1 in order to even apply for teacher education here at Montclair. They have to have that. We have increased fieldwork hour requirements. So now they have to have 175 hours of supervised classroom time, or in a school setting, before they do their full-time teaching. And the alternate route requirements are increased too. It used to be very minimal, like 4 hours in the summer. Now it's up to 50 before they can take that job. Alternate route has also been increased. So it's now, at least in terms of coursework and substance, it's fairly similar to the traditional route. The difference is just when you're doing it. And there's a duration requirement too. There's also higher GPA requirements. So nobody's going to argue with the higher GPA, but we also have the Ed TPA. This year was a pilot year in New Jersey. Next year will be a non-consequential year for the candidates. As long as they submit, they'll pass as we learn how to do this. But this performance assessment requirement, any of my colleagues here who are involved in teacher education know that this probably took up a lot of oxygen in the room this year. And then also something else which kind of flew a little below the radar, and it's this may end up being hard to enforce, but the spirit is there, that cooperating teachers must have an effective, highly effective rating under the Teach NJ law, where there's a 4-tier rating system. And so this is a way of ensuring high cooperating teacher quality. And there's also, just in the past few months, the state legislature passed a teaching students with disabilities requirement of 6 credits or its equivalent, including instruction about children with autism. So all of this is now in the mix of what we have to do as teacher educators, and this is even before anything STEM related. Okay. All right, so again, I may be moving a little quickly through these, but I think these are best mulled over later. So these slides will be available, and if you want to talk more about the data behind them, I'm happy to share anything that I'm about to show you. And by the way, all the data I'm about to show you, it's all public information. It all comes from publicly published reports. I've just analyzed it through a STEM lens, and it's led me to these things. Okay, so we have 144,000 teachers in New Jersey. About 7,600 have a science certification. That could be the elementary, or it could be bio, physics, chem, geoscience, military. So we have military science. Who knew? But that counts as science in the certification. We have 9,600 math certifications, and we have 495 technology certifications. And this is coming from the NJDOE certificated staff report about which code certification individuals have. Okay, so if we look at our population by gender, all New Jersey teachers, it's 77% female. Our math teachers and science teachers, a few more male teachers, but still dominated by females, except in New Jersey, except in technology education teachers, but there are far fewer of them. Those tend to be more male. If we look at the total New Jersey population, it's about 55% white, about 20% Hispanic, about 15% black, about 10% Asian. And again, this is from census data. But when we look at the teacher population, we see it's overwhelmingly white, almost 85%. And I'll just make a plug. We know that this matters because of, people bring their own experiences to the classroom and what they count as science, what they count as relevant, how teachers elicit students' ideas about their prior experiences. We do find that this matters. It's not a one-to-one that, if you have a white teacher, that white teacher can't teach a student who's not white. But when we talk in probabilities, it is more likely that somebody who doesn't have the experience of being non-white in a STEM field in New Jersey, they may not have the full range of imagination about what that student is bringing in terms of resources to that class if they're not white. Okay, so now I'm going to break it up into math, science, and technology. So I analyzed this for the years of experience. We see that more than 25% of our math teachers have less than 5 years experience, and about 17% have gotten some alternate route certification over time. When we look at science teachers, again, 25% of science teachers have less than 5 years of experience, and a little higher, about 22% of them have gone alternate route. And in technology, again, the numbers is much smaller for technology teachers, but again, we see the same pattern. About 25% have less than 4 years experience, and a smaller percentage of those alternate route. When we look at the age of our teachers, I think this is one of the things that surprised me, because I think in my head I had conflated alternate route with second career teacher, probably older. But when we look at the traditional, the numbers for who's going into traditional teacher certification versus alternate route certification, the traditional is higher, although the alternate route is slightly older, but not by much. And there's a lot more traditional route teachers. So this idea that alternate route is populated solely by older second career teachers is simply not true. And we see the same pattern in science teachers. And then when we look in the certification areas, and this is where the high need area data comes from. Over the past 5 years, when we look and see where have the most alternate route teachers been certified, so biology wins, chemistry comes in second place, middle grade science and physics come in next. And it's interesting because biology is actually one of those areas we know just from anecdotal data and from within our network, just vacancies. There's a lot more chemistry and physics openings than there are biology openings, and many of the biology openings are for middle grades. So this is sort of our first clue that shortage area list may not be completely accurate. I think and I'll just say this, there's a market out there for somebody who can develop a solid chemistry teacher education program. There's clearly a need for it. from the chemistry, from the data itself. Okay. So let's shift to talk about retention. In New Jersey, we have two main ways of talking about retention. The most common is, over the past 3 years, we've had these education preparation provider reports. And what these do is track one-year completion data from different programs across the state. And then we also have the New Jersey Certificated Staff Reports. This is just a list of every teacher in the state, what their certification is, how they identify gender, race. This is where that other data came from. What school they're at, et cetera. So for the EPP reports, Education Preparatory Provider Reports, they just report persistence of 1 year. Did this person stay for another year? And they use that standard certificate. Did they apply for that standard certificate? That's a measure of that. For the certificated staff reports, it's a little messier, but we can track persistence individually over multiple years. And so the data I'm going to show you in a moment comes from looking at those certificated staff reports over multiple years and tracking individuals that way. So this is from the EPP reports. When we look at the retention, these are one-year retention rates. The first thing that pops out is the alternate route is around 50% retention rates for 1 year. And the traditional routes are a little bit higher. And in science, we see it's not quite as dire as we see in math, but still the traditional routes are around 80%, and the alternate routes are about 50, 60%. So I don't believe this. I think this is not right. And I found that this isn't right, and I'll show you in the longer data. So measuring over 1 year is not an accurate way of measuring retention. And I'll talk about why in a moment. And then we have our technology teacher retention. Okay, so everybody has a copy of this in your red folder, and I'll leave it to you to look at later. This is compiled from 4 years of individual institution reporting on these education preparation provider reports. And there are counts here. How many people were certified in each of these areas between 2010 and 2014? I encourage you to go and look at those EPP reports online for your own institution if you're in New Jersey. There's some interesting stuff on there. One thing that jumps out, however, is that while we have all the traditional programs listed, and there's a lot of them, over 20, all the alternate route ones are combined into a single line. So we don't have individual information about the different alternate route programs. And there's a handful for math and science. But we don't have disaggregated information on alternate route programs. And I think that's something that should probably change in the near future if we're going to be making decisions about this. So again, if we look at the average number of teachers per year, mathematics is we're producing about 400, a little over 400 math teachers every year in New Jersey, about 200 biology teachers. The math works out interesting. If you think about biology teachers, you have 1 grade of biology, like a quarter of a school taking biology every year, but you have all 4 grades. You need, 3 maths, but usually 4 levels of math in a school. To me, that's an indicator of a mathematics teacher shortage there, that we're not producing enough math teachers because it's not commensurate with the biochem and physics production there. Okay, so I want to take a moment and talk about Richard Ingersoll and his work. He spoke at the Noyce conference last summer. And I'm a big fan. I like what he does. But he draws his retention data from a very different source. He uses the school and staffing survey, and necessarily he has to use older data, but I think it's still very relevant, and it's a sampling technique, so he's not looking at every teacher the way the New Jersey data is. And some of his findings over the past decade are relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So his argument is that we do produce enough math and science teachers. The problem is teacher turnover, that we are losing the math and science teachers that we prepare. And he says if we can solve that problem, we won't have the math and science teacher shortages that we have. He also notes that there's less of a cushion in the STEM fields of a non-working labor pool. Like when you think, if I asked you I won't do this, but if I asked you, who knows an unemployed social studies teacher? Many of you might raise your hand. But there's a lot fewer to say, now this room would have a sampling bias, but if I said, who knows an unemployed science teacher? there are fewer of those. And so he points to that as part of the reason for the shortage. And he looking across data, and I confirm this for our New Jersey data, math and science teachers have about the same annual rates of leaving as other teachers in other subject areas. He also notes that few of the measured individual characteristics of first-year teachers were related to their likelihood of leaving. So some of the demographic data that I showed earlier does not seem to correlate with teacher attrition. But what is correlated with higher attrition is lower levels of pedagogical preparation and teaching practice. And he uses the term methods courses, but he just means pedagogical methods. When I say methods, I'm thinking like science methods, math methods. In his work, he just means basically teacher preparation. And so first-year teachers who took more courses in teaching methods and strategies were significantly less likely to depart. And this is the really intriguing stuff. So as a former high school physics teacher, before I jumped into higher ed, I was a physics teacher at Trenton High in Trenton, New Jersey. And I completely identify with this. Greater teacher autonomy is connected to reduced turnover in low-performing schools. So he's looking at issues of teacher autonomy as a really strong factor in teacher retention. And to me, that has a lot of face validity. Okay, so here's what I'm about to show you. And some of you who've seen the poster already, I just want to show you here's how it was generated. So going through the New Jersey data, and I had a couple fun weekends with Excel. I had to convince people I was having a good time doing this. It was like putting together a puzzle. But you see each of those is a name there, and so I have the list of 251 teachers who were all certified in 2010. So each line represents a single teacher, and when we get to the large chart, it's a pixel. It's a pixel width as each teacher. So after year one, 251 teachers were counted as teaching year one. These are all science. This is just science, by the way. I had ambitions to do math and was humbled pretty quickly. This one took me long enough. So after 2 years, down to 80%. After 3 years, 65%. I call this the march of attrition, right? 52%. And I was tracking individual teachers, and I was using birth year to see if people changed their name or moved schools or any of this stuff. So this is all like hand collated data. So it was 47% of these teachers persisted over 6 years. Now, I am a fan of data visualization, and if you know Ed Tufte's work, this is a very famous map of Napoleon's march on Moscow in the Russian campaign. And it starts with 400,000 French soldiers, and by the time they get to Moscow, it's the top tan line. They're at 100,000, and by the time they get back to Paris, they're around 10,000. I was inspired by this map to create this one. All right. So here we start, and this is the same data that I was showing you. And the part that other one didn't show was when people switched schools, when people took a leave of absence and returned to the same school. And so my question was, how many people are we really losing? And what's our retention rate really when we look over more than just 1 year? Because we know how tumultuous that first year or two after teaching can be for students. But the truth is we are losing a lot of people in that first year. And there are a couple little surprises in here. One relates to the teacher quality argument about, I've heard publicly, 95% of teachers are rated, effective or highly effective, so tenure isn't working as a, quality process. Well, if we look at our science pool here, at the point where they reach tenure, only 28% reach tenure. And this is before they added another year. So in 2012, it became 4 years in a day to tenure instead of 3 years in a day. But even still, so thinking about that, that's a really small number who actually make it to that tenure point in that first year. So we need to add that to the conversations about teacher quality. There's a couple other interesting things in here. When we look at the 6-year retention rate, it was nearly identical for alternate route and traditional. When we count, who's moving schools, who's taking a leave to look for a job, there was statistically no difference. We also find that the story for science teachers of color is a bit harsher than even we had anticipated. So only 25% of the teachers of color who started during that first year made it to year 6. Now, if they went to teach at a private school, we lost them out of the data. We don't see them. They look the same to us as if they left teaching altogether. So there's some of that we don't know. But it's interesting. The very small number actually switched schools, and we have a couple of school jumpers. There's one person there. That's 1 pixel tall at the end who went to 4 different districts in 6 years. Some of you may know that person. I don't know. So let me just use that information, and you all have a copy of that in your folder as well. The questions we're going to address this morning are all around these phenomena. I haven't tried to explain these too much, but I want us all to be all talking about the same set of facts. I think oftentimes when we talk about science teacher recruitment, preparation, retention, if we're not all working from the same set of facts, we're going to come to very different solutions. So I at least wanted to set that table for us. So in the morning, we're going to break into 4 sessions. Everything is on this floor. This is the main room. The presidential dining room is there, and then we have rooms 1 and 2. And as Tom and Quincy mentioned, there will be a panel report coming out of this, so everything is being audio recorded and transcribed. That's why we ask you to share your name and institution. So the first panel is a focus on STEM teacher recruitment. How can community colleges and 4-year programs work together to increase the pipeline of STEM teachers? That's people starting at the beginning of that graph. Then we have a panel focus on secondary science teacher preparation. What should be part of that? Then we have a focus on policy. How well is the teacher certification process meeting the needs of schools? So we have these categories of biology teacher, chemistry teacher. Is that the right category? I thought it was interesting. We haven't really used the general science certification in New Jersey in a while, but there's still some alternate route people who are getting those, and I'm not sure quite how that happens. But and principals love that because that gives them flexibility to move people around, especially if they want to, move physics from a senior level course to a freshman level course. Having that flexibility of somebody with a general science certification is gold. So how well is that teacher certification process meeting our needs? And then we have a focus on elementary, middle grade STEM teacher education. And again, how do we teach? And I admit conflating early childhood and elementary. I know those are not always the same thing, and middle grades. But this idea of how do we teach those teachers of young children to be enthusiastic ambassadors of STEM? And then after those morning sessions, we'll have our keynote speaker, Jessica Thompson from the University of Washington is here, and her talk is going to be fantastic. I think it's exactly what we would love to have here. And then in the afternoon, when we break out at 2 o'clock for our afternoon sessions, one group will look more closely at STEM teacher recruitment. Who are we recruiting into teaching? And we'll talk about those second career teachers and out-of-field teachers there. And then we have a parallel session to the morning session, a focus on math teacher preparation. And again, focus on policy. This one, instead of being on recruitment, this one is on support. And that phrase induction, which we loosely mean support during those first, they say 1 year at the state level. We like to say 3 here at Montclair. That's the model that we've found really powerful. But how do we, and then 5 years, how do we support them over 5 years? And then finally, we wanted to fold computer science into this mix here, because computer science occupies an interesting space where, in order to teach computer science, at least in New Jersey, and I believe New York may be similar, you either have a math certification or a business education certification, and that comes from the old keyboarding and typing, model. And there's this question of, well, where's programming? Where do I get to learn, Python? Where does that fit in? How do we prepare teachers? And what are we even calling computer science? So that's part of that whole discussion there, and I'm looking forward to hearing that one as well. Okay. So the time now is it's about 9:35. We have a couple minutes. If we have just a note about this room and all the other rooms, we have 2 microphones set up in the main room, and then there's handheld ones in the other rooms. So we can do a couple minutes of questions or Q&A about this talk. You will also notice that there is space built into the program. So each session is 75 minutes long in a 90-minute space or something like that. There's an extra 15 minutes in there, and that's That's on purpose so that you can meet people and talk to them and have those extended side conversations, which are the real purpose of the conference, right, John? Right? And John Settlage is fond of saying that. And then the other thing is that, I don't know what the other thing was. Let that go. So thank you. And we can take a couple moments for questions or comments about the data you saw or questions that you had or anybody wants to take a shot at reframing some of the things that I've presented to you this morning. We can do that as well. So if you'd like to ask a question, there are microphones here at the front. I ask that you do just say your name and institution.
Gopal Subramaniam from Queen's College. I'm wondering, do you see any difference in the data of people who start their program as an undergraduate versus somebody who is starting with a PhD degree or something and still taking the traditional route to certification? Do you differentiate the two data?
So I'll answer that question by saying we don't have those data. We only have the data that's collected by the institution. If each institution collects that data, we can have that. I know that's one of the questions we have about our programs here, but I can't answer that, and it's definitely not in the state level data. It may be in the SAS data where somebody says, I was an undergrad when I got certified versus I was a graduate. So, I do think Richard Ingersoll has talked about that point a little bit, but I don't have any data from New Jersey on that. Sorry. You just get up and talk. You don't have to. There's no raising hands here.
Hi, I'm Lauren Madden from the College of New Jersey.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi. I was curious about when you had the middle level science certification data up there, did that include those who get with an elementary degree who get the middle level endorsement, or was that exclusively people with middle level science certification?
So it's if they got.
Because that seems like those are two different categories, but they're still highly qualified to teach middle school science. So I wasn't sure.
So it's a function of the way the data is reported. So if it's reported by the university, so if the university says we issued one certification in elementary specialization with science, the data that I showed here was I used year 0 as my indicator, so that's how I figured what was an initial certification, but there may have been alternate ones that weren't captured there of people who were already teaching and got those certifications later.
So I would want, just because our elementary ed graduates get an elementary general license, and then they apply for that endorsement as soon as they graduate, so they get it like in July.
So
And
they
I'm sure
would be
TCNJ
captured
isn't reporting,
before they teach, yeah.
So I wonder if there's a big chunk missing from those data.
Could be.
Yeah, all right.
Tom Marlowe, Seton Hall. And actually, I want to take the other side of the middle school math endorsement and wonder if that's really a good idea, because I think a lot of the fall off in the students who want to pursue mathematics and computer science is when they find that mathematics isn't quite what they've been taught it was. That if you're preparing teachers who don't really have a perspective on where the subject is going, it really makes a big difference with the students who later pursue whether education or professional career in those disciplines. And I expect the same will apply to science as well.
Thank you.
Good morning, Joy Burns-Johnson from Princeton Public Schools and New Jersey GERA. So in defining high-need schools and the policy challenges, you talked about the new students with disabilities. And so I'm really curious about, in your disaggregating some of that information, about how that has impacted, and I know that's new for 2016, but the challenge as a practicing teacher is this increasing number of students with special needs and accommodating students for NGSS, where you meet the needs of students in wheelchairs, students with autism, whether it be in science, technology, and now particularly for computer science, given the very isolated way that it's been taught. So the question, I think, is one for the folks who will be on the policy panel about what we can do to, in Noyce and or in school districts, accommodate not only pre-service teachers, but in-service teachers that are going back to secure that level of certification, because schools have changed. And practicing teachers, I think, have the same needs as pre-service teachers, especially with regard to that, and whether you saw a trend, if any, in that kind of impact on why they're leaving.
So I didn't see that, and I don't know that I could see that in the data. But I think it's the balloon in a box problem, right? As soon as you put it in this side of the box, something comes out. The problem is that we're trying to squeeze an awful lot into pre-service teacher preparation with very little to come after that. And I mean, some of the grant-funded programs that we have here, we've been able to support teachers after they leave us, and that has had the nice effect, especially with the NMUTR and Woodrow Wilson programs that we have here, of bringing in those cooperating teachers and those mentor teachers who are exactly the population that you're talking about. But that's sort of a spillover effect. It's not necessarily, a differently designed program might say, here's what you're going to learn before you become a teacher of record, and here's all those other things that you're going to need to learn after you become a teacher of record. And there's a sequence of learning opportunities after that goes beyond just professional development. And I think we can take a cue from the medical profession about the continual professional development that doctors have, with the caveat that the pharmaceutical industry can find a way to sell things in that process, right? But that we, and not that our PD providers don't do the same thing, but this idea that we have a continuum of learning, and we have students pay for it to get certified at the beginning, but there's much less support afterwards. And I think that when I look ahead into what I think teacher education is going to look like 50 years from now, I think it's the 3 years or 5 years after you become a teacher of record is going to look a lot more like those first couple years before. The question is, who's going to pay for it? We did some back of the envelope calculations and figure out, like, what would it cost to buy out one prep period for every for every new science teacher in the state. So, and back of the envelope, it would cost $100 million, which we have a school budget of 6.1 billion. Okay, 100 million. That's one Zuckerberg unit, right? We could pay for that if we wanted to. And so I think and a large part of this comes to state support and the question of who pays for that. It's a thorny question. And without, I don't have a good answer for that right now. Okay, maybe 2 more questions, and then we'll take a break.
Hi, my name is Daryl Dietrich. I'm a computer science teacher at Warren Hills High School. So first of all, I just want to thank you for good data. I love good data. It's a nice thing. Just to expand upon what you're saying about computer science before, we have a computer science teaching endorsement that hopefully by the end of the month will be on the governor's desk. It's working its way through legislation, and we'll be working with the Department of Education on implementing that. And also, we are working on a praxis exam for computer science education that will hopefully be released in September 2018. So we'll give us some more data here in the next couple of years, I hope.
I love it. Thank you very much, Doug.
So I'm Kathy Hyde from Penn State University, and I'm wondering about the state-sponsored solutions to the shortage problem. For example, in Pennsylvania, once one is certified in one of the areas, they can get certified in any other area through the praxis test. Well, there's two issues there. A couple weeks ago, I talked with a certified English teacher who planned to take the praxis test without taking any collegiate mathematics in order to get certified to teach in mathematics. The second is the praxis test has been boiled down to essentially high school mathematics. And I think all of this is essentially working against the notion of deep understanding of mathematics that should inform the teaching of mathematics. I'm wondering whether similar things are happening in other states and what's being done to counteract that.
Feel free to jump in, anybody. I mean, so the one piece of that I can grab a hold of is like the very different nature of teacher certification regulations across states. In the Northeast and on the West Coast, we tend to have the strongest certification requirements. But there are other places, when we look at this, like ABCTE, and Jen, I could tap you for like 5 or I'm sure you know this better than I do, but like there's so many other places in the United States where you can take a test and be in a classroom in a couple weeks. And I hadn't heard that about, so the praxis is the only requirement once you're certified to get in another area. I mean, that we get what we pay for, right? And I think something like that, if we're talking about teacher quality, may have consequences down the line. But I want to be careful about not painting with too broad a brush, right? So there may be, there's always the Bill Gates argument, right? Like, well, if Bill Gates wanted to be a teacher, we'd make it impossible. We'd make him go back to college. Well, maybe somebody who really knows their stuff can show they have the content, but can they show that they can actually teach? Do they know how to actually be in a classroom with 30-odd children and plan instruction for 5 days a week and think about assessments and all of the daily work that goes into teaching. So there are the teaching requirements differ tremendously across states. And I think we're probably second most rigorous maybe to Massachusetts. We have some Massachusetts people in the house, right? I don't know. Okay, maybe I might ask you later how difficult it is there compared with here. But I get a sense it's a rigorous process. But if you go out to other states, and I don't want to pick on any one state in particular, but the teacher regulation certification requirements are much lower. And it says maybe we need that for the labor force, but maybe we don't. I don't have a good answer for that. But I do want to point out how different it is across different states, certainly. Okay. Thank you, everybody.